There are sounds that transcend language, that communicate something primal and immediate to anyone who hears them. The cry of a child is one of those sounds, but on the night of July 29th, 2014, the crying that echoed through the second floor of an apartment building in Pocheon, South Korea, was not ordinary. It wasn't the sound of a child who'd scraped a knee or woken from a nightmare. The neighbors who heard it, lying in their beds in the darkness, knew instinctively that something was terribly wrong. This was the sound of desperation, of fear, of a small voice calling out from a place of profound distress. The sound was so disturbing, so clearly wrong, that the neighbors did what perhaps they should have done long before. They called the police. When the officers arrived at the apartment building and knocked on the door from which the crying emanated, no one answered. But they could hear the child inside, his sobs undiminished by the closed door, each cry seeming to carry a weight that belied his young age. The police tried to force the door open, putting their shoulders against it, but it wouldn't budge. They called for reinforcements and, while waiting, had an idea. Perhaps they could access the apartment through the balcony. They retrieved a long ladder and positioned it against the building. As they climbed, they noticed something fortunate. The balcony door was open. The first officer to reach the balcony and step through into the apartment was immediately assaulted by an odor unlike anything he had encountered in his career. It was the smell of rot, of decay, of things left too long in darkness. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, the scene that revealed itself was one of almost incomprehensible neglect. Mountains of garbage rose around him, black plastic bags filled and tied and stacked upon one another until they reached the height of a grown adult. The floor beneath was broken in several places, the flooring cracked and buckling. The walls and furniture were covered in grime and mold, patterns of darkness spreading across every surface. And everywhere, skittering in the shadows and across the piles of refuse, were cockroaches. The officer had to push his way through the maze of trash, creating a path toward the source of the crying. There, in what appeared to be the main bedroom, or at least the room with the least amount of garbage obstructing it, sat an 8-year-old boy, watching television alone. According to the officer's later testimony, despite being 8 years old, the child was small and fragile, showing clear signs of severe malnutrition. But what struck the officers most powerfully were the boy's eyes. His gaze seemed clouded, almost bluish, as though he was disoriented, unable to fully comprehend what was happening around him. It was the look of someone who had existed in isolation for so long that reality itself had become something distant and unclear. The first thing the police did was remove the child from that apartment, taking him to safety. Only once he was secure did they turn their attention to the larger question looming over this scene of horrific neglect. Where were this child's parents? The officers began a systematic search of the apartment, moving from room to room, checking every corner of the space to ensure no one else was present. It was during this search that they encountered something unexpected. A massive red ceramic jar, standing more than 80 centimeters tall. The jar was a traditional kimchi container, the kind used to ferment the spicy cabbage dish that is a staple of Korean cuisine. Some Korean families still make their own kimchi at home, preparing large batches to last through the seasons. But a jar this enormous, sitting in the middle of an apartment, taking up nearly an entire room, was highly unusual. The officers decided to open it, perhaps expecting to find spoiled food contributing to the apartment's overwhelming stench. The moment they removed the lid, they were hit by a wave of putrid air far more intense than the general miasma of the apartment. Whatever was inside this jar, it definitely wasn't kimchi. Visible at the top of the container was what appeared to be a blanket or covering. One of the officers reached in and pulled at the fabric. As he did, they felt and saw a black viscous substance coating everything below. And then they understood what they were looking at. Inside this traditional jar meant for preserving food, they had discovered not one but 2 human bodies in varying stages of decomposition. If you want to discover who these people were, how they ended up in a kimchi jar, and where the parents of that crying child have been all this time, stay with me as we descend into one of South Korea's most disturbing domestic crime cases. And if you find yourself drawn to the mysteries that hide behind closed doors across Asia, to the stories of secrets kept and truths eventually revealed, consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more such stories waiting to be told, each one a glimpse into the darkness that can exist alongside ordinary life. The first question investigators faced was deceptively simple. How did they know there were 2 bodies in the jar? The remains were mixed together, decomposed to various degrees, making separation and identification extremely difficult. But there were telling details. At the top of the jar was a body that was partially decomposed, where some human structures were still identifiable. Below that was a layer that included a piece of flooring, a section of floor tile or covering that had been placed deliberately. And beneath that flooring was a second body that had decomposed to an extreme degree, reduced almost to liquid. The presence of two distinct stages of decomposition told investigators something crucial. These two people had died at very different times. One death was relatively recent, the other had occurred many years earlier. Following this grim discovery, more than 60 additional investigators were dispatched to the city of Pochon. All of them focused on answering at least two critical questions. Who were the victims? And where were the primary suspects, the parents of that 8-year-old boy? In conversations with neighbors, police learned some basic facts about the apartment's recent history. The boy's mother, whom we'll refer to as Mrs. Lee to protect certain identities, had been living in that apartment with only her son. Her husband, Mr. Park, hadn't been seen in more than a decade. According to neighbors and later confirmed through records, Mrs. Lee had once been married to Mr. Park, and the couple had 2 children together. Neither of those children was the 8-year-old boy who had been found crying in the apartment. That boy's existence presented its own mystery. In 1995, the couple's younger son had been only 5 years old when tragedy struck. He died in an accident. The loss of a child is one of the most devastating experiences any parent can endure. And for Mrs. Lee, it seems to have triggered a psychological break from which she never fully recovered. Following her son's death, she began exhibiting symptoms of compulsive hoarding, accumulating objects and refuse, unable or unwilling to discard anything. According to acquaintances and her own older son, this hoarding behavior began shortly after the death of her youngest child and only intensified over time. As the apartment filled with more and more accumulated garbage, as the living conditions deteriorated beyond what most people would consider habitable, tensions in the household reached a breaking point. Mrs. Lee and Mr. Park began fighting with increasing frequency. Their arguments grew more intense, more bitter, and then one day, according to what the older son told police, Mr. Park left the house and never returned. That was the story. He had walked out about 10 years earlier, presumably unable to continue living in those conditions, and had simply never come back. No one had filed a missing person report. No one had questioned his absence too deeply. People leave marriages every day after all. After her husband's departure, Mrs. Lee eventually began dating again. She had several boyfriends over the years, including the biological father of the 8-year-old boy found in the apartment. This man was a foreigner, likely from Bangladesh, and he no longer lived in Korea by the time police began their investigation. But what investigators discovered about the boy himself was perhaps even more disturbing than the bodies in the jar. The child had never been officially registered. He had no birth certificate, no legal existence in the eyes of the state. He was, in the most literal bureaucratic sense, invisible. This little boy had been so thoroughly neglected from the moment of his birth that he had never attended school, never seen a doctor, never been acknowledged as a human being requiring care and protection. In South Korea, education is compulsory from age 6. When neighbors asked Mrs. Lee why her son didn't attend school, why he seemed to spend all his time inside the apartment, she had a ready answer. She told them he had been born prematurely and had disabilities that required special education, and she was looking into appropriate schools for his needs. It was a plausible explanation, one that satisfied casual curiosity without inviting deeper scrutiny. Meanwhile, the reality was that this child spent hours, sometimes days, alone in that garbage-filled apartment with no food, no care, no acknowledgement of his basic human needs. It was child abuse through profound neglect, a crime of omission that had been ongoing for years. Mrs. Lee had another serious relationship after the father of her youngest son. She became involved with a man who worked at the same company where she was employed. He spent considerable time at her apartment, and their relationship appeared serious. But when their boss discovered that 2 of his employees were dating, he became angry, for reasons that were never entirely clear. He had a policy against workplace relationships. As punishment, he fired Mrs. Lee's boyfriend, not her, but the man, making an example of him perhaps. This termination put considerable strain on the relationship. The couple began fighting more frequently. The man's pride was wounded, his future uncertain, and then, like Mr. Park before him, he simply vanished. No one saw him again. No one filed a missing person report. Could he be one of the bodies in the kimchi jar? The police were beginning to see a pattern emerging. Investigators worked methodically, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, trying to piece together a timeline of disappearances and deaths. It was during this intensive investigation that Mrs. Lee's older son came to the police station and made a confession that would partially answer one of their central questions. He admitted that he had helped his mother hide his father's body inside the kimchi jar. This confession represented a significant change in his story. Initially, remember, he had told police that his father had left home 10 years earlier, walking out and never returning. Now he was revealing that his father had actually died, allegedly of natural causes, and that he knew this because he had assisted his mother in concealing the body. He told police the following story. When he was still a teenager, he had come home from school one day and opened the door to find his mother crouched on the floor with his father lying unconscious in front of her, as though she had been trying to lift or move him. His mother, seeing her son, began trying to explain, saying she didn't know what had happened, that she'd been sleeping and woke to find her husband dead. She told her son she needed to put him there, gesturing toward the large kimchi container, at least until she could figure out what to do. The son, shocked and young, and perhaps conditioned by years of living in that dysfunctional household, to simply accept his mother's explanations, helped her place his father's body inside the jar. Throughout this process, Mrs. Lee maintained that her husband had died of natural causes, but most people found it bizarre that if death had occurred naturally, she wouldn't simply call the authorities, arrange for burial or cremation, handle the death through normal legal channels. Why would anyone choose to hide a body in a kimchi jar and keep it for more than a decade unless there was something to hide? By the time the son made this confession in 2014, the statute of limitations for concealing a corpse had expired. He could not be prosecuted for helping his mother hide his father's body. The legal system had granted him immunity through the simple passage of time. But his testimony gave investigators crucial information about at least one of the bodies. Police conducted detailed forensic analysis to try to identify both victims, to confirm whether one was indeed Mr. Park, and to learn the identity of the second person. The bodies were severely decomposed, the remains mixed together in ways that made separation difficult. The task was formidable, but remarkably, investigators managed to identify both victims through fingerprint analysis. Even from the body that had been decomposing for more than 10 years, forensic specialists were somehow able to extract usable fingerprints. The science involved is complex and speaks to the advancement of forensic techniques, but the result was definitive. A match was made. The body at the bottom of the jar, the one that had been there longest, was confirmed to be Mr. Park, Mrs. Lee's first husband. The body on top, less decomposed and therefore more recent, was identified as the boyfriend, the co-worker who had been fired, and who had subsequently disappeared from everyone's lives. During their analysis of the jar's contents, investigators also found traces of a substance called doxylamine, a sedating antihistamine commonly found in sleep aids. The presence of this drug among the remains suggested that Mrs. Lee had used medication to incapacitate the men before killing them. At least, that was what the police believed. But belief and proof are different things, particularly in a legal system that requires evidence beyond reasonable doubt. These were suspicions, theories built on circumstantial evidence. To move forward, they needed to question Mrs. Lee herself. She was eventually located hiding in the home of yet another boyfriend, concealed inside a closet when police arrived. When questioned, she provided what could be described as a partial confession. Regarding the victims, she maintained that her husband had indeed died of natural causes, just as she had told her son years earlier. But regarding the second body, her co-worker boyfriend, she admitted to killing him. She told police she had given him medication to sedate him and then strangled him while he was unconscious. The trial began in January 2015, and Mrs. Lee faced charges for 2 deaths, concealment of corpses and child abuse through neglect. Initially, prosecutors sought a life sentence, arguing that the evidence supported conviction on all charges and that the severity of the crimes warranted the harshest possible punishment. But the sentence was eventually reduced to 18 years in prison. The reason for this reduction was the prosecutor's inability to prove definitively that Mr. Park had been murdered. His body was too decomposed to determine an exact cause of death. While doxylamine had been found in the jar, experts couldn't confirm whether the dosage would have been lethal, or even whether Mrs. Lee had administered it. The legal burden of proof could not be met for that first death, so she was only convicted for the second murder and the associated crimes. Mrs. Lee is scheduled to be released from prison in 2032. Many South Koreans believe that 18 years is insufficient punishment for the gravity of what she did, killing at least one person and possibly 2, concealing bodies for years, and severely neglecting a child to the point where he existed as a ghost, unregistered and invisible to society. When this case circulated in South Korean media, there was even dark speculation online about whether Mrs. Lee had been attempting some macabre form of preparation with her ex-husbands, using the kimchi jar for its traditional purpose of preservation, but with human remains instead of vegetables. These rumors were unfounded and sensational, playing on cultural imagery to create horror where facts were disturbing enough. There is no evidence of cannibalism or any such intent. Mrs. Lee was guilty of murder, of concealment, of neglect, but not of the more lurid crimes people imagined. What remains when we step back from the specific details of this case is a portrait of dysfunction that went unnoticed for years. An entire human being, that 8-year-old boy, existed in a modern city, in an apartment building with neighbors on all sides, and yet no one knew he was there. No school reported his absence because he was never enrolled. No doctor noticed his malnutrition because he never received medical care. No government official questioned his lack of documentation because he was never registered. He was a phantom, living in a space that had itself become phantasmal, cut off from the normal rhythms of society, by walls of garbage and a mother who had long since lost her ability to function within social norms. Neighbors who called police that night because of a child's crying may have wondered why they hadn't acted sooner. Perhaps they had heard crying before, or noticed the smell, or observed the strange reclusiveness of the woman in that apartment. Perhaps they had told themselves it wasn't their business, that they didn't want to intrude, that surely someone else would say something if something was truly wrong. This is how tragedies unfold in plain sight, through a collective decision not to see, not to question too deeply, not to get involved in what might be uncomfortable or complicated. Mrs. Lee's descent into hoarding behavior following the death of her youngest son suggests that grief broke something fundamental in her psyche. Hoarding is often understood as an attempt to exert control, to prevent any further loss by refusing to let go of anything, even garbage. But in clutching so desperately at the physical objects around her, Mrs. Lee lost her grip on everything else. Her relationships, her responsibilities, her connection to reality. Her living son watched his father die or be killed and helped hide the body, then went on with his life, telling no one, carrying that secret for a decade. What kind of psychological damage does that create? What does it do to a person to participate in such a profound concealment? And then there was the boyfriend, the co-worker who lost his job because his boss didn't approve of workplace relationships. He was probably angry, probably feeling unjustly punished for a relationship between consenting adults. He fought with Mrs. Lee, tensions escalating in that pressure cooker of an apartment, surrounded by garbage, by the hidden evidence of her previous crime. Did he discover the body in the jar? Did he threaten to go to police? Or did Mrs. Lee simply see him as another problem to be eliminated? Another potential loss to be prevented through the most final means available? We'll likely never know his final thoughts, whether he sensed what was coming when she offered him medication, or whether he trusted her until the very end. The 8-year-old boy who survived this nightmare was eventually placed in care, presumably with family members or through the social services system. One hopes he received therapy, support, help processing the unimaginable circumstances of his early life. He spent his formative years in isolation, surrounded by filth, periodically left alone without food, never experiencing the normal activities of childhood, school, friends, play, medical care, even basic acknowledgement of his existence. The psychological scars from such profound neglect run deep and shape a person's entire life. What kind of adult does that child become? How does he learn to trust, to form relationships, to feel safe in the world when his earliest experiences taught him that he was invisible, that his needs didn't matter, that the world was a place of garbage and neglect and hidden horrors? There's something particularly disturbing about the use of the kimchi jar as a hiding place for bodies. Kimchi is a traditional food, something made with care, often by families working together, meant to nourish and sustain. The large ceramic jars used for fermenting it are passed down through generations, part of cultural heritage and domestic tradition. Mrs. Lee took this symbol of nourishment and preservation and perverted it into a tomb, a concealment device, a way of keeping death close while pretending it didn't exist. The bodies decomposed in that jar the way vegetables ferment, a grotesque parody of the natural process the jar was designed for. The case raises uncomfortable questions about what we owe to each other as neighbors, as community members, as fellow humans, sharing space in crowded cities where we're physically close, but often emotionally distant. How much responsibility do we bear for noticing when something is wrong next door? When does respecting privacy cross over into complicity through willful ignorance? The neighbors who finally called police did so because the child's crying became impossible to ignore. But by then, 2 people were already dead, and a child had suffered years of neglect. What if someone had acted sooner? What if the boss who fired Mrs. Lee's boyfriend had checked on him after a few weeks when he didn't show up for his final paycheck? What if Mr. Park's family had filed a missing person report instead of accepting the story that he'd simply left? What if someone had asked why an 8-year-old was never seen playing outside, never going to school. These what-ifs don't change what happened, but they remind us that tragedies like this are rarely inevitable. They unfold over time, through accumulating choices and non-choices, through small moments when intervention might have altered the trajectory but didn't. Evil operates not just through dramatic acts of violence, but through the slow accumulation of neglect, of looking away, of deciding that something isn't quite our problem. Mrs. Lee was certainly responsible for her crimes, but she operated within a context that enabled her, that failed to notice or act on warning signs, that allowed a child to exist as a ghost and two men to disappear without significant inquiry. In the years since the trial, this case has become part of South Korea's catalog of domestic horror stories. Cases that reveal the darkness that can exist behind closed doors, even in orderly, developed societies. It serves as a reminder that prosperity and modernity don't eliminate human capacity for violence, neglect, and dysfunction. The apartment in Pocheon where all this occurred is just an apartment now, presumably cleaned out, renovated, rented to new occupants who may or may not know what happened there. The kimchi jar was taken as evidence and presumably remains in storage somewhere, a silent witness to the crimes it concealed. Mrs. Lee sits in prison, counting down the years until 2032, living with whatever thoughts and feelings she has about what she did. What's the lesson in a case like this? Perhaps it's simply that we should pay attention, that we should trust our instincts when something seems wrong, that we should be willing to make the uncomfortable phone call or ask the difficult question. Perhaps it's that grief and mental illness left untreated can metastasize into something monstrous, and that seeking help isn't weakness, but necessity. Perhaps it's that children are vulnerable in ways we sometimes forget, that they depend entirely on adults to protect them, and when those adults fail them, society must serve as a backup system, but only if we're paying attention. The crying that echoed through that apartment building in July 2014 was a cry for help that finally received an answer. But it came after so much damage had already been done, so much suffering had already occurred. It was the cry of a child who had been invisible for his entire life, finally making himself heard, forcing the world to acknowledge his existence and his pain. Those neighbors who called the police saved his life. They can't undo the years of neglect he'd already suffered, can't bring back the two men who died, can't reverse any of the harm that was done. But they did stop it from continuing. They chose to get involved. They chose to see and to act. As we close this examination of the kimchi jar murders, we're left with images that are difficult to shake. The mountains of garbage, the clouded eyes of a malnourished child, the ceramic jar holding its terrible secret, the woman hiding in a closet when police came for her. These images stay with us because they represent something we'd rather not acknowledge. That horror doesn't always announce itself obviously. That it can unfold slowly in ordinary places. That the monsters we fear might not be strangers lurking in dark alleys but people living next door, deteriorating behind closed doors, descending into darkness one choice at a time. If this story has left you contemplating the mysteries and horrors that hide in plain sight across Asia, consider subscribing to this channel. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, each one a window into the complexity of human nature, the fragility of social order, the ways that ordinary lives can be touched by extraordinary tragedy. In every apartment building, on every quiet street, behind every closed door, there are stories unfolding. Most are mundane, blessedly ordinary. But some, like the one we've examined here, are anything but. These are the stories that need to be told, remembered, and learned from, lest we forget how thin the line is between the life we know and the darkness that can swallow it whole. The kimchi jar sits in an evidence room somewhere, empty now, cleaned of the horror it once contained. But the story it holds cannot be cleaned away. It persists, a reminder and a warning, a piece of the vast puzzle of human behavior that we're all trying to understand. May we learn to see what needs to be seen, to act when action is needed, and to remember that behind every closed door, there might be someone who needs us to care enough to knock.